Hello, welcome to a getAbstract webinar on digital transformation, opportunities and threats. Good morning from Boston, but I know many of you, it's already the afternoon and evening in Europe, and on the West Coast, even earlier in the morning. I'm Andrew Savikas, the president here at getAbstract US. I am thrilled to be joined today by Paul Michelman, the editor-in-chief at Sloan Management Review. Paul previously held executive roles at Safari Books Online, where we actually worked together, as well as at Strategy and Business and Harvard Business Review. Paul and his team at MIT Sloan Management Review have been putting out some just exceptional content on digital transformation, and especially what it means for the leaders looking to drive that kind of change. MIT SMR is emerging as one of the most important chroniclers of the impact of technology on business and leadership. So welcome, Paul, and thank you for joining me today.
Andrew, I am delighted to be here, and you are hereby hired as our spokesperson going forward.
Excellent, excellent. First, I just want to say how excited we are to have MIT Sloan Management Review as a key content partner, and even more excited that we've now expanded that partnership. So starting today, getAbstract readers have access to the full text of any MIT Sloan Management Review article that we have summarized. We're very excited about that. I also want to welcome all of you out there and thank you for joining us for this conversation. Please, if you have questions or comments, you are welcome to put them into the question tool within GoToMeeting, and we will do our best to address those at some point along the way. So, Paul, you spend a lot of your time talking to executives and leaders, across a number of industries. I know you just spent about a week in Lisbon at the Web Summit with 75,000 business folks from around the world. So you really have a front row seat on what's on their mind and what they're thinking about. First question for you is really, we've been using the word digital for decades now. Why is everybody suddenly talking about digital transformation? Like, what does that term actually mean?
Yeah, I think there was a real kind of tipping point or change in the conversation around technology, its role in the organization, and just the digital world that began, it depends on kind of where you are and what industry you're in, but began 5-7 years ago and has really picked up steam over the past few years. And so when there certainly is not a single kind of shared definition of digital transformation. So I can only explain the way we think about it and our contributors and the people who I engage with think about it. It's based on this, this belief, although I think it's more than a belief now, I think it's kind of a fact, that technology has gone from a supporting function in the organization, right? Something that helped to power a strategy, to being the thing on which the company competes. Companies operate on technology now, right? It is not a support function. The traditional view of IT is completely outdated. Technology has moved from the edges of the organization to the center of it. And this has implications not just for the ways companies compete, but the way they operate, right? And it fundamentally changes and challenges a lot of our, what I think are now kind of outdated beliefs of how organizations should operate.
Yeah, your point about IT moving away from the edges, that's so true. I mean, it used to be IT was this part of the org chart. It was this vertical thing that sat next to or alongside of HR or finance or marketing. And now, I mean, any conference space, any conference you go to, whether it's marketing, whether it's sales, all they want to talk about is the technology landscape and the vendors there. It's really moved to be this thing that affects everyone. And I think something that I've heard you talk about before is how one implication of that is it means that everything is now getting pulled along at that pace of change that technologists have been dealing with for so long.
Yeah, right. I mean, and that's a double-edged sword. Once we kind of we embrace the idea that we're all digital organizations, and you hear that a lot, and it can sound a little bit empty, right? But what it basically means is that we are all operating in this digital world with digital technology, enabled by digital technology. And once you're kind of at that point and you embrace that idea, you also embrace the idea that technology keeps advancing and keeps changing, right? You had made this observation that a developer understands that throughout the course of her career, she's not just going to be the master of a single language, but she's going to master new languages over and over and over. And it's that kind of mindset that I think leaders of organizations, whether they're in technology or not, really need to embrace. We are in this period of continual change and continual advancement. It's driven by technology, but it's not really about the technology.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned, developers and programmers, and the way it strikes me that people learning computer programming aren't learning a computer programming language. What they're doing is learning how to learn computer programming languages, because they know those are going to keep changing over the course of a career. And it sounds like, what you're saying and what you're seeing is that's happening throughout the organization, is that expectation that not just you're going to learn a skill, but you're going to have to learn how to keep learning new skills, because it's just going to keep changing.
Well, that's right. If you believe that the world is going to keep changing, of course, it always has, right? We're not the idea that we're in a state of constant change is not new. What's different is the pace of change, right? And the frequency of major changes. It is happening in a way that is unprecedented, right? Change is as old as the hills. But the pace of change has changed fundamentally, right? And again, as we embrace this idea that technology is at our core, that we are, to some degree, I want to be careful how I say this, at the mercy of the speed of technological change, right? We have no choice, but not just to keep up with it, but to stay ahead of it. But it's a mistake and a trap to focus too much on the technology itself. It's what the technology can do for the organization and how it drives the organization to act in new ways. It's really more about people and process, ultimately, than it is about the specific technologies.
Yeah, that was something that was really a recurring theme in much of what your organization has written and what others have been saying about digital transformation, that at first it sounds like the technology, but that's not really what it's about. It's about the people and the organizations. And maybe one way to reinforce that would be to talk about perhaps the arguably the least tech savvy part of the organization, which is often the sort of board level. At that level, ideally you're thinking about long-term strategy and resource allocation. So why are companies at that level and boards at that level feeling pressure to deal with this notion of a digital transformation? Is it about responding to new opportunities, or is it about adapting to emergent threats?
Well, I think most common, or the way most organizations enter kind of a mode of transformation or recognize the need for kind of a fundamental transformation to compete in the digital world is because of a competitive threat. It's outside in, right? You are seeing a change in the competitive landscape. That might be the emergence of a new competitor who you were totally blind to. It could just be a shift in a kind of fundamental shift in the market based on changing consumer expectations. It could be any number of kind of major changes in the competitive environment that are your organization's wake-up call, right? And so in those cases, the organization will begin by thinking about strategy, right? They will be thinking about outside-facing functions and how to bring digital into those. That's fine. It's a perfectly good place to start. But if you stop there, you will ultimately fail, because you've got to change how the organization operates. It's not just about the value it produces. It's about the way it produces value, right? And that sounds pretty logical when you think about it. And I have the great benefit of seeing the work of lots of experts and talking to lots of really progressive leaders to understand what they're seeing and what they're experiencing. But not everyone can simply come to that understanding organically. I certainly wouldn't have, absent the position I happen to be in. And boards in particular can really struggle with this. Any successful change effort, whether we're talking about digital or any kind of culture change in an organization, ultimately is a combination of bottom-up change, where there are pockets of the organization that are recognizing an opportunity or a threat, and they're modeling kind of new behaviors that other people can then follow, right? And top-down. But there's one guarantee. If there isn't leadership from the highest parts of an organization in a major change, it will fail. Without the resources and the focus and just the behavior, then the process then the process is doomed. I mean, you can't think of an example where leadership wasn't behind a major change. So where does leadership start? It starts at the board. And this presents, an interesting challenge. At its worst, an existential one. The least digitally savvy part of the organization, with some exceptions, I'm going to paint a broad picture, is at the board, right? Because boards tend to be more experienced. They tend to have been in the world longer, least detached from what is going on with the advancement of technologies, least savvy about technologies, and least savvy about what those technologies mean for the organization, how it operates, and how it competes. And there have been some really interesting studies done that looked at the prevalence of digital savvy in boards. And what those studies have found is that there is a strong connection. These are public companies, so we're looking at publicly available performance. Sure. Strong correlation between performance and the representation of digital savviness at the board.
Now, I was reading some of that research, and it came out from MIT, I believe. I think you've published about it. But what I found particularly interesting was how the researchers decided to categorize board members as digitally savvy or not. Can you speak a little more about that?
Sure. So you're referring to a body of research done by two MIT researchers, Peter Weil and Stephanie Werner, who do terrific work looking at leadership and digital issues. They use natural language processing of the publicly available biographical materials of board members at large public companies. I forget what the cutoff was, but major, call them top 2,000 global organizations. I'm not sure that's accurate, but it'll give you an indicator. Sure. And they were able to determine that they had set kind of a formula for what constitutes digital savviness, and it basically was an AI. It was a bot that went and searched all this material and would recognize someone who had digital savviness or did not. And what they found was a digital savvy board had at least 3 people who passed that kind of litmus test for having digital savvy. And that's where they saw real shifts in performance.
Wow, that's amazing. Something else, a comment you made as we were talking beforehand about this was how important it was for at that board level, at the CEO level, to accept, I think the phrase you used was the risk of a chance of bumpy numbers as you're navigating this transition. Can you say a little more about what that means and what those risks really are?
Sure. I mean, this is about having a long-term vision and believing in it, right? And of course, having a long-term vision in this age of continual disruption is really challenging. So I would call it a long-term direction, and a direction that a CEO can articulate. The CEO really has to manage up. I mean, first of all, if your CEO doesn't have a clear vision for what it means to compete and operate in a digital world, well, you're in trouble. So we're going to assume we're talking about organizations who do. But it's not enough for the CEO to be very clear in the vision for the rest of the organization, looking down, and I hate to use kind of hierarchical terms, and we should talk more about that, but looking out to the organization, they have to be clear, and they have to be doing all the right things, modeling behavior, cheerleading, all that good stuff, but they've got to be managing up. They've got to be managing their board. Because as organizations go through major shifts, right, the best of them have this magic formula where they can kind of conduct business in the current state, right, meanwhile changing the organization, and these things only come together, right? They come together up here in this perfect harmony where there was no disruption in the current business in order to get to the new state. Well, that's a myth. That really doesn't happen. If you believe that we are entering or have entered kind of a fundamentally new era of competition with technology at its core, and if you believe that we're only just beginning this journey, and that AI, I think, represents a wholly new kind of set of organizational challenges, you have to be prepared to make some pretty big shifts, and those include outward-facing things like new products and new strategies and new customer relationships, and they include internal things around shifting what the workforce looks like, how people are organized, and the skills that people require and the investment needed to develop those skills, all of those things are going to challenge the balance sheet. And so the CEO has got to be working with the board to help the board see and understand, and then also, frankly, to external stakeholders, shareholders, whose expectations might be challenged. Hopefully not in great ways, and hopefully not for long periods of time. But those risks are real.
Yeah, absolutely. And the scale of the transformation you just described reinforces that this is not a discussion about finding and adopting the new technology. It's really about redefining the organization, and that of course takes strong leadership. So looking a little more into the organization itself, what does it mean to say that a leader is digitally savvy?
Yeah, I think there are kind of several aspects to that, and I don't think any are more important than others. But I'll start with simply the idea that a CEO and other, by the way, C-level leaders, but this begins with the CEO, needs to embrace their responsibility to understand technology at a level and in a way they've never had to in the past, right? There was a time when, one, you would simply delegate all technology decisions to your CIO and to your IT department, right? We're long past that. But what CEOs can't do is even delegate kind of strategic understanding of the technologies to other people, right? Organizations have CTOs these days. They have CDOs. They have lots of leaders whose job it is to understand technology. But it doesn't mean the CEO doesn't possess that responsibility herself or himself. Because if you're competing on a technology platform, right, you have to understand what a technology can do for you strategically and organizationally to be an effective leader. So one, it's kind of embracing an individual's own capabilities gaps and addressing them and becoming more digitally savvy, right, themselves. But that in some respects, that's a blunt change. Right? If you make time to learn, you can learn. I don't mean to dismiss that. Making time to learn is a huge challenge. But that's only the beginning, because a digitally savvy leader, or just a digital leader, right, is someone who leads in a fundamentally different way. So it kind of comes back to the basis of this conversation, and that is we are in a period of continual change, and change that happens more rapidly than in the past. The leader's job focuses today on managing strategy as an organic and ongoing process, right? Gone are the days of the once a year strategy retreat, right? Or even the biannual or even quarterly strategy review. Strategy is a day in, day out management exercise, and that can't be delegated from the CEO. That is the CEO's principal responsibility, managing strategy on a day in, day out basis, which means they don't have time for some of the things they used to do. Jeannie Ross, who has written, another MIT researcher who's written a terrific new book called Design for Digital, talks about how important it is for leaders to stop needing to be the smartest person in the room. Part of it is just in general, to be an effective digital organization is to act more organically, which means that decisions can be pushed out to the edges of the organization. And of course, technology enables really smart decisions to be made everywhere in the organization, right? Which means there's just less decision making required of the CEO. The CEO has to learn to sit on his hands, on her hands, and not always kind of direct an answer, even if they feel confident they know what the answer should be. But it's also not just about recognizing that they shouldn't be the smartest person in the room at all times. It's not even being in the rooms they used to be in. Right. As technology continues to advance, and whether we like it or not, it is going to make more decisions for us, which is going to change everyone's job, including the CEOs. Mark Foster from IBM, who's another very thoughtful executive around digital transformation, calls it leading from the edge, right? Leaders have a responsibility to set direction. The need for vision has never been more important, right? You want a charismatic leader who can align the organization in a direction, but then who continues that role from the side, from the edge, rather from the top. That is a big change for a lot of executives. It's really uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's just there's all these paradoxes here. We talk about how digital transformation is not about technology, it's about the sort of people, and yet a requirement of success is that your top leadership understand technology. And it's these things only work when the CEO and the board are really bought in and are behind it, and yet it's only effective when more and more decisions are actually made, as you said, at the edges, when the CEO is not in the room. It's interesting paradoxes as part of this conversation. It also, sounds like what you're describing is a need for leaders to, in many ways, and in fact, I think you have a section on the site that you've collected some content that you've really called about relearning to lead. It's not learning, it's relearning some of the lessons that people might have picked up along the way. And can you talk a bit about what some of the themes are when you look to present content and topics to help leaders understand how they need to think differently and act differently, and maybe even push themselves out of their comfort zone?
Yeah, it's a great question. We do our best to try to be empathetic to our readers. Mm-hmm. So our readers are, they tend to be relatively senior executives in organizations, and importantly, those who aspire to be in those roles, right? And it's hard to keep your finger on the pulse of what's important, and you don't want to just react. You also want to be a beacon. But that's why I spend as much time as I possibly can out of the office, right? Talking to leaders and kind of just asking them what their problems are. But as it turns out, the solutions to a lot of the challenges that people face aren't entirely new. What's new is the context. So coming back to your question about the relearn to lead feature, which we think is really terrific, it is a combination of, I think, of evidence to suggest that there are new skills that leaders need to develop, right? Some of which we were just talking about, and just the need to maybe reprioritize which capabilities they draw on, to go back and find some capabilities that might have been more important when they were leading a team than leading a full organization, and bring those to bear. It's a bit of an abstract answer, but it's a tough one because I don't think that anything we publish suggests that we have to throw out everything we've learned in terms of strategy or organizational behavior or supply chain management or leadership. But the context is fundamentally different, and we all have to adapt to what that context is, and maybe just as importantly, embrace the idea that whatever context we're operating in today is only here for a second, because it's going to change again.
Right. Yeah, it's funny when you use that word, adaptation, and you use the word organic, and I don't think it's a coincidence that some of the language that's emerging to describe what has to happen in organizations really draws from the language of living organisms, which have to continuously adapt to an entirely unpredictable future. And it's probably no coincidence that there's some lessons that might be learned from that sort of environment. Something else that we hear a lot about talking about digital transformation is that it also involves, not just changes, in the way the leaders think, but changes in the way people work. And a lot of that is expressed in organizational sort of culture. So, for example, you in an article that you published this summer about building a digital-ready culture, the authors actually said, for many legacy companies, culture change is the biggest challenge of digital transformation. And I'd love to hear a little more about what some of those challenges are and what that really means. What kind of changes need to happen within an organization's culture to truly adapt?
Culture is always a fascinating topic, and it's also in my world, in the world of kind of management ideas, it's also a topic that will stoke people's passions as much as anything, right? And you have these powerful examples, these kind of paragons of corporate culture that have built brand, and I think just built bottom line success around their culture. Southwest Airlines, IKEA, right? These kind of names that those of us who, they might not everyone may think of those as cultural icons, but those of us who kind of study this field, and there are plenty of others, right? And you see it when you're on a Southwest Airlines jet. You see it when you're in an IKEA store. This kind of commitment to a very particular type of experience. And there are those who believe that type of approach to culture, kind of this quote, the way we do things around here, has never been more important, right? When the organization is, acting like this as opposed to like this, having values that are shared becomes even more important. But there's another side to this coin, right? There's another side to this argument, and it's one that I've advanced, not because I necessarily believe it's true, but because it's helpful to stir the pot a little bit, especially when people are kind of deeply connected to legacy ideas. If we believe that organizations are increasingly going to be kind of project driven, and we're increasingly working in teams that aren't just dispersed geographically, but are crossing organizational boundaries, meaning extra organizational boundaries. Listen, the facts are that organizations use more contract talent today than they used to. It's grown enormously, right? You've got unicorn companies in Silicon Valley who do nothing but source talent for organizations. The facts are there. We are working, and certainly my own organization follows this pattern, right? We tend to work in teams, and those teams tend to be made up of people both internally and externally, right? And this doesn't work for every organization, but it's increasingly common. Well, how do you have a culture that can be stable and consistent if people are coming in and out of the organization all of the time? I think it really challenges some of these fundamental beliefs that culture shouldn't just be the way people treat each other. It should be the way we get things done. And I think it's important that we recognize that, right? And there's that piece. You've got organizations that are basically remaking themselves all of the time, and that they're bringing people in and out of the organization, and I think that's going to accelerate for both good reasons and maybe some reasons that aren't so good, but we can set that aside. There's also been the introduction of these new tools, right? So there's this acronym that I just learned last week at Web Summit, GAST. It stands for Google Docs, Asana, and Slack, right? And there are lots of others, but these are three tools that have had a huge impact. Lots of others too, but we don't need to list them all. But the tools like these, collaboration tools that were built to facilitate the types of organizations I was just describing. Organizations where people work asynchronously across timelines, across geographies, and inside and outside organizations, right? Using those tools has had a really, has had kind of, in many cases, some pretty significant, often unintended cultural impact on organizations. I was talking to a leader from Asana, in fact, last week, and he talked about the kind of pervasiveness of engineering culture, which I thought was a really interesting observation. What he was talking about, particularly with Asana, and forgive me if a lot of people out there aren't familiar with Asana, but it's a project management tool originally intended for software developers. It allows for a project, lots of people to collaborate on a project, kind of simultaneously working on their own things, very much in keeping with kind of agile methodologies. And it's been introduced to many organizations through development teams and technology teams, but as leaders have seen how effective a tool it can be to help manage software projects, they've kind of brought it to bear across an entire enterprise and are using it to project manage everything. And it makes us all begin to think like engineers working on agile projects. Okay, that's interesting and good, but you step back and you suddenly notice we're talking to each other differently. We're engaging with each other differently. Again, it's not just that one product, but something like Slack, which is also widely used in organizations, and for the most part quite effectively. I love it. It's a terrific tool. But it's gone way beyond its original intent in organizations, which was to replace email and facilitate ongoing conversations for people who otherwise would have been limited to email. Well, it's done that, but it's just as frequently replaced face-to-face conversation of people who are right down the hall or right down the cube farm from one another. So this is a really long-winded and perhaps circuitous answer to your question, but the kind of combination of these things have thrown culture kind of into chaos, right? And you have to wonder whether these broad kind of deep cultures that dictate the way people behave and engage with each other might have outlived their usefulness, and if just a shared view of process is really the culture.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I'm glad you started talking about tools, because that's another thing, again, because we tend to focus on the technology piece of it, that there's this assumption, well, if we just put Slack out there or Microsoft Teams, which is the corresponding equivalent, and Google Docs and Asana and some of these other things, that magically people will start doing things differently. And you know, sometimes it seems that you know, talking about engineering culture, you know, certainly an engineer who's familiar with an agile project management tool can quickly adapt from Asana to you know, an alternative. But for an organization or a group of people who haven't ever used something like that before, it's a big shift. And that gets to something that was described in, I think it was a book published by your colleagues at MIT Press, but I think one of the authors was one of your editors, was the technology fallacy, you know, that really underscored this, that it's not about technology, it's about the people and the changes there. And there was this concept of stages of digital maturity for an organization. And, you know, it seems to me that the effectiveness or responsiveness to some of these new tools probably depends quite a bit on where an organization is in this sort of maturity piece. And I would love to hear a little more about what those kind of, I think there were maybe 3 kind of rough categories, but like, how can an organization understand where it is in this level of digital maturity and where it is along this kind of transition?
Well, I mean, I think that the answer to that question begins with kind of familiarizing yourself with the research. So there's been some really terrific research that has come out of what's now a long-term collaboration between MIT Sloan Management Review and Deloitte on digital maturity. And forgive the self-promotion, but it's really terrific research.
It is. It's fantastic stuff. It really is.
And you know, it explains this kind of arc, right, from a company that's just beginning a digital transformation to what we call digital maturity, right? That is, that they have kind of fully embraced, frankly, a lot of the things that we have been talking, right, about, that they've taken this real 360-degree view of digital transformation and have transformed as much as a competitive player, as a working organization, right? And there are some tools embedded in this research that will help a company understand where it is, but simply going and reading the descriptions of the characteristics that a digitally mature company has versus one that is developing versus one that's beginning will tell an organization a lot. Here's what you're likely to find: that you have attributes that cross all 3. Most organizations do.
Right.
The reason why we single out some organizations that are digitally mature is because they're kind of remarkable, right? Some organizations have done a really good job focusing on innovation and kind of competitive responses. Some have done a really good job at high levels of leadership. Some have done a good job at addressing skill gaps. Some have done a good job on cultural change, depending on how you feel about that. It's rare that an organization has done everything equally well on the same timeline. More than anything, what this research does powerfully is point out what are the kind of key levers that an organization needs to flip on this pathway to digital maturity.
Right, right. Yeah, there was something I noticed, because there were a few different examples of organizations, and, you know, a couple things seemed to emerge. You know, there was at its core, there was a need to drive more innovation in terms of, I think the phrase which was, I think really stuck with me, was that the customer's expectations are moving faster than any single team can keep up with, right? And so there was this need to bring expertise to bear from different people in an organization. So this notion of cross-functional teams as the only way to respond to ever-changing sort of customer expectations. And, you know, I think the example was maybe CarMax, but just how they bringing together a cross-functional team with, I think they required that the team had a user experience person, a software developer, and maybe a marketer or something like that. But then they would perhaps be others, and they would give the team a clear objective, and everyone had to come back every 2 weeks and report out on what was happening. And it was sort of, lather, rinse, repeat on this to start a cycle of cross-functional pollination and innovation. And that example was an important one, but that kind of pattern of behavior seems to repeat itself across organizations that have moved further along this path of saying, we're going to bring these cross-functional teams together, give them a short window of time to operate on, and use that to generate more momentum and learning for others in the organization.
That's right on, right? And so, you've got to start somewhere, right? So most organizations will kind of find an opportunity to launch a cross-functional team, and when successful, those teams are then modeling a set of behaviors that other people can follow. But even a single cross-functional team challenges all sorts of organizational norms, right? Who's in charge? Who do I report to? Who's judging the success of the performance? What are the analytics that we're going to use to judge this team's success, and over what time horizon? How long are we going to give this thing to see if it works? You've got to be really patient. Organizations like CarMax are remarkable because they're doing this at scale, right? And when you think about an organization that is a set of I'll use my hands here, a set of cross-functional teams, it's a bunch of circles and hives, right? And the whole thing looks like a hive, right? And then the weird thing is that technology is somehow connecting all of them, right? But even before we get to kind of the seamlessness that technology should be bringing to organizations, the organization that is a set of cross-functional teams, by the way, that are temporary always, looks completely foreign to the present organization. And there's another really interesting tension here. Whether you're talking about cross-functional teams or talking about, saying, bringing AI into an organization, there's a natural inclination to start slow and to kind of go into things with an experimental mindset. And that's fine so long as you're doing these things in service of a clear longish term vision for how the organization is going to evolve. Right? Sam Ransbotham, who's a really terrific business school professor and researcher at BC, has a great line, kind of, small steps get you small wins, right? You have to take, and so this is a serious tension for organizations to wrestle with. Yeah, you got to start somewhere, and you can't cure cancer in 10 days. But you have to have a vision for where the organization is going, and make sure that the steps you're taking go in that direction. Because organizations that don't, they miss the real opportunity. The opportunity isn't to spin up a few cross-functional teams and have them succeed. It's to kind of weaponize this new organizational structure to win as an organization. Those are, the organizations that win. Weaponizing is kind of an aggressive word, but that's what they do, right? They have a vision for how the organization is going to change the way it functions, and they put that in service of creating value for their customers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love that metaphor you draw with your hands of the hive, and you just imagine that these teams, that level of some of them are ephemeral in nature, that they're going to sort of combine and recombine and dissolve as needed to respond quickly to these outside opportunities and threats. Just feels like a much more likely structure to succeed than the more rigid traditional models that we're all so used to. But that also brings up an interesting point, these notion of these cross-functional teams, many of which will bring together people who don't necessarily work together every day before, and may not be together for more than a few months or even less. I suspect that puts some interesting pressure on the traditional sort of middle management within organizations. And I'd be curious if what you're seeing, what are the implications for the people who have spent their, are most comfortable as the team leader of a functional team in an organization? What is some of this sort of tension and pressure happening at that level of the organization?
Yeah, I wrote a column a couple of years ago. It was called "Don't Get Caught in the Middle," and the thesis of that was that the traditional role of intermediaries, right, is really being challenged. And there are all sorts of intermediaries in the world, but middle managers are one of them. I love middle managers. Middle managers are what makes organizations tick. But they're also under a huge amount of pressure. And again, I'm speaking broadly, and this doesn't apply to every organization.
Sure.
But we live at a time where value is being created on the edges of value chains, not in the middle. Right? There was a traditional role for human beings who would interpret. Right? They would literally interpret language. They would bring parties together and connect them who couldn't otherwise find each other. And again, middle managers are one of the most critical versions of that. The traditional middle manager's role is to interpret what is coming from above and make it actionable, right, by the teams they manage. And yes, there's still some need for that, but it's less. Again, as we move away from the hierarchy, and coming back to how you introduce this, and we go to the hive structure. Where is the middle management layer? I don't see it, right? So the good news is that in most organizations, the traditional, almost anachronistic version of the middle manager, where they weren't a doer, all they were was someone who carried out orders from above. That's largely gone away already. If I was in a middle management role, I would make sure that I was doing a lot of the things that we are suggesting senior leaders do, and kind of embrace the idea of being, the leader on the edge. I don't think that just applies to being the CEO, right? Whether you're on the edge of the whole hive or just the edge of a team, there's still a very important role for leadership in a team, in the organization, but it's coaching more than dictating, right? And it's being a doer and kind of a coach leader at the same time. So, a lot of this goes to skill development, right? What we all need to do is challenge ourselves to make sure that we are as relevant for what is coming as we possibly can be. Now, that's hard to do when you don't know what's coming, right?
Right.
But we talked about the importance of organizations and their leaders to accept, and I think even embrace, the idea that we are in a state of permanent adaptability, or that is what is required of us. That applies to us as human beings as much as anything else. And it's not just middle managers, but you can see where middle managers are feeling a certain amount of pressure if we're looking at flattening hierarchies, or maybe turning triangular hierarchies into these weird oval shapes, right? It does suggest that there is that kind of traditional interpreter and intermediary isn't going to be as essential. And frankly, technology is going to be doing some of that work.
Yeah, you're so right about that. I think about, that role of interpretation and facilitation and communication and letting the team know what's happening elsewhere. But that takes a lot longer than if the team can have the awareness directly, have the direct connections among the different sort of cells in the hive, so to speak. And there's a term I remember we used, we used when we worked together. I remember one of our colleagues came up with it, but this term of ambient awareness, which was, and I saw that again in looking at the CarMax example and some of the other ones in there, where things like these. It wasn't just that these teams that were working in this agile model were coming together every 2 weeks to report on what they were doing, but everyone, all the leaders in the company, were invited to attend those meetings to have that visibility on what was happening, and ideally to help reduce the dependence on some of those interpreters. But I think your point about that permanent adaptability and permanent unpredictability just reinforces something else that seems to be a real common thread looking at organizations that are successful in moving down that maturity spectrum, which is cultivating a culture of continuous learning. What are some ways that organizations are able to actually get to the point where people are kind of taking ownership of and being successful in not just learning a skill, but really developing continuous learning of continuously changing skills as part of their tool set?
Yeah, and so now I'm gonna begin to answer your question with a total contradiction of something I said. this is a major cultural issue, right, for organizations, and it is a cultural issue. So we have a terrific article coming up. It's coming out in a few weeks in our December issue, written by Gianpiero Petriglieri, who is a terrific researcher at INSEAD. The premise of his article is that workplace learning is work. Now that sounds kind of obvious, but it is clearly not embraced by the vast majority of organizations in the world. And so what his point is this, that particularly now, I mean, I think he would say always, but particularly now, as companies recognize that there is a capabilities gap in their organization, and there will continue to be capabilities gaps in the organization unless people are on this kind of permanent learning path. We have to stop treating learning as a luxury or something that the employee is responsible to do on their own time, or if they are, if they are being required, shuttled to go to some 3-hour seminar on active listening. Not that I think active listening I do.
I hear what you're saying, Paul.
Then yeah, thanks, Andrew. And then they're, in most contexts, they're responsible to kind of make up for whatever productivity time they lost on their own. That fundamentally, that is a broken approach to learning. So one, organizations need to embrace the idea that learning is work, and that learning needs to be embedded into people's work schedules. There needs to be an assumption that people are going to spend X amount of time learning, right? It doesn't have to be the kind of Google 20% slack time, but there needs to be a very clear recognition in people's, in what is expected of an individual, that they are going to spend X amount of their time learning. That's only the beginning of it. Then it's, what are companies to do to facilitate that? The most important thing, well, I'm not gonna rate these by importance, but the next thing is ensuring that each individual has a learning plan that makes sense for them, and there are two levers here: what the organization needs, where the organization is going, and the skills the organization needs. And then where the individual is going, where they want to go, right? And what they view as the capabilities they need to develop. Those things have to be in harmony. If they can't be made in harmony, that suggests a poor fit, frankly, between the individual and the organization. Doing that takes a lot of work. And here's where we still need managers and middle managers, right? It's to work with individuals to plan kind of learning objectives that are measurable, and which comes to the third. Companies need to measure employees' success at learning and have conversations. So it's not just about companies measuring the employees, but it's having active conversations between employees and managers. And so here I'm being a little bit antiquated, about learning goals and measuring success against those goals. Few of us, in fact, I don't know, I don't think I've ever encountered somebody whose performance review, whether that's annual or on some other basis, incorporates their success at learning. It should. It's one of the most important things that you do is learn. We need to be able to measure these things and value it and put our money where our mouth is.
Yeah, absolutely. And yet I think there is certainly a bit of a resistance to that when, someone in a manager or a leader wanting to get involved with, probably legitimately desiring to help someone craft a learning sort of learning path and sort of goals. But then I think the typical reaction to think, well, I can't develop a course. I don't know how to develop a certification. That's something that the learning people can take care of. But I think what you're saying is something that's not anywhere near that formal. That's more about, because it can't be. We're not, this is a too quickly evolving landscape. So, what might it look like for a manager to have a conversation with a team member to start to map out something that was not about a 3-hour course on one extreme, and was also hopefully not about, here, just go look at this pile of stuff, but was really trying to get at specific skills in a time-bound and measurable way.
Well, right. I mean, I don't think there's, I don't think I have ultimately what is the right solution to that, but there are certain things that you need. One, as an organization, you have to have a set of tools and opportunities that are already available for people.
Yeah.
And I imagine in many cases that's a combination, right, of kind of desktop learning tools, access to seminars, maybe depending on where you are in an organization, access to external kind of executive education opportunities. But you've got to have, it begins with having a commitment to actually to having, to making available a set of resources and opportunities, right? That's kind of table stakes. And alas, I think sometimes that's where it ends. We've got these tools, we've got these resources. You can go look up, you can go look, you can go read a book abstract on this topic, right? Those are great. We need these things, right? We need lots of tools that help people learn, but that's just not enough, right? You need to have a strategy that supports that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And when we talk about digital transformation and we talk about this need to keep, I think the term that keeps coming up, there's two sort of variations. There's sort of upskilling and reskilling. What do those words really mean?
I think they probably mean different things to different people, which is actually response, right? To me, I'll give you my interpretation. Reskilling suggests kind of, I don't like reskilling. I mean, I guess it's a word that we need. Reskilling says your skills aren't useful anymore, and we're going to change you. Upskilling says we're going to enhance the skills that you already have, right? Unfortunately, there's probably some. There are people who have been in jobs that are going away, and we can't do anything about that. And I don't think it makes a lot of sense to fight to keep positions that no longer produce the value they once did. But we have a deep responsibility to help people who are finding themselves in those positions, or maybe are in a function or a job or even an industry that is showing kind of that it's cresting, is to help those people develop new capabilities, or maybe identify capabilities that they have and enhance those capabilities for new opportunities that are emerging. And I think this also kind of dovetails to a really important kind of buy versus build decision that organizations need to make. And it's really not, it's rare that an organization says, we don't need any new talent, in spite of the changing in the world. And it's also rare that an organization says, we don't value our existing talent at all. It's where are you on the continuum? And this is a really important high-level strategy. Companies need to be able to map where they are going against the skills and the skills of the people they have. Let's talk about people and not skills, because skills reduces the transactional, right? Here are the people we have. Here's where we're going. Where are the capability gaps? And what is the combination of skill development internally and external expertise that we're going to follow in order to address those gaps? You have to think about this strategically. Some of the smartest organizations, the smartest people I know in this space, kind of look at I call it a buy to build strategy, right? That they very smartly identify very high performers from other organizations who have excelled in that capability space, right? That gap between where the company is and where they want to go. And they don't bring them in by the truckload, terrible metaphor. They don't go and hire they don't go and hire 1,000 people because they're going to need 1,000 people in these roles. They might hire 10 or 15 who come in and push the organization. They begin to address the gaps, but then they actually become trainers inside the organization, right? People who have these skills, who have developed these skills, these capabilities, who are operating, who have come from maybe they come from an industry that's further advanced in digital transformation, come from financial services or somewhere which happens to be an industry that's kind of further out in the good direction. And they help model behavior, they help model skills, and they help train. And I think that can be a part of an effective talent development strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. Because in the example you gave, if the organization knows it needs 1,000 people or with this particular skill, the combination of how many new skills you're going to need very quickly and the job market that we're in, it's just not practical to think you're going to be able to add that kind of, from the outside.
Absolutely right. And also the failure rate of new people is much higher than than exists.
Yeah, exactly. And that, it feels, again, getting back, it feels more organic to sort of bring some in and have it spread, throughout the organization. And I think there was another kind of case study from some of the research. I think it was Bloomberg, where they, obviously a very data-driven organization, but recognizing that they also needed to keep their data people continually updated on what was happening. And I think they deployed a sort of a little bit more of a formal course part of it. But I remember that piece of it was, doing a small group at a time so those people could go out and sort of spread the knowledge within there. Absolutely. So, just as a sort of a final question here, what on this notion of buy versus build and this sort of thing, what can an organization do to start to kind of cultivate a culture that starts to think about digital transformation in this way of recognizing it's not about getting from point A to point B, it's about getting onto a new path that's not going to end?
So this is a highly unsatisfactory answer. Having a CEO who believes that, and having a CEO who doesn't just believe it, but acts it and is out there promoting this idea throughout the organization. So, I mean, a real quick anecdote, and because I don't have the numbers right, I'm not going to name the organization. There's a very large organization who is now a very successful model of digital transformation. But 4 or 5 years ago, they were getting beaten up. They were being victimized, for lack of a better word, by digital competition they maybe should have been coming and didn't. And the CEO said to his direct reports, so the CXO suite, we need to start this process of digital transformation. Go do it. And it wasn't he in this case, he stayed in the background, feeling like it would be more effective to have the leaders of the various parts of the organization lead the way. And they invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in getting a transformation program started that focused, by the way, on capabilities development. And it failed, right? It was only when the CEO took it upon himself to be the cheerleader, right? And to be out in the organization. This is a huge global organization, but he made it his job to be the digital transformation leader. And they went from an investment of several hundred thousand to something like 10x the original investment. Only then did the shift really start happening. Because what we're talking about at scale, digital transformation is going to fundamentally change the enterprise. It's going to change the way it acts, the way it operates. It's going to change the way it competes. Nothing like that can really start without somebody at the very top. But I just want to one bow on this. That person can be influenced from below, right?
Right.
In fact, the CEO doesn't come to this. I mean, most CEOs are somewhere on this path now, one hopes, or I fear for your organization. But it also needs a lot of voices in the organization who will speak truth to power and who will help leaders recognize how they are exposed. So it does take this combination of both. But really, there's nothing so important as the CEO who is willing to lead this themselves. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Paul. It reinforces there is that these paradoxes. You need the top, and you need that pushing up from the bottom as well. Well, thank you very much, Paul. I really appreciate it. I think we're coming to the end of our time, but I have learned a great deal, as I always do in talking with you. And those of you in the audience, I encourage you to dive right in. We have in getAbstract, we have I think 41 already summaries of MIT Sloan Management Review articles, and now you can click on through and read the full text to get more, and we look forward to adding even more in the months ahead. So thank you very much, Paul. I appreciate your time, and thank you very much for joining us in this getAbstract webinar.
Andrew, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.